In the 18th century, Dr. Joseph-Ignace Guillotin strongly favored the guillotine as a gentle way to kill. During the French Revolution, the guillotine killed many people at once. France stopped using it in 1977. The way death worked made people afraid and changed how people felt about executions. At that time, many people thought of the death penalty as a big show for the public. However, the guillotine was a faster and less painful way to die than hanging or traditional chopping with an axe. People who were involved in the French Revolution and other groups who saw people being put to death by guillotine had different emotions when the blade fell. Some people watching questioned the so-called painless device of death, while others wanted the blood and gore of old practices. In either case, the guillotine's broad use made it famous as a tool of supposedly merciful death in history. Groups of women gathered to knit and watch the blade drop. A lot of the time, groups of women would gather around the guillotine and knit or talk while the heads were being cut off. These women, who were called tricoteuses, used to get together for local government debates. But finally, they were told they couldn't be in public places, so they started watching executions for fun. During the events, they made small things, like Phrygian caps, also known as liberty hats. As the French Revolution went on, the women, even though they came from families, were linked to violence and anger. It was said that tricoteuses counted their stitches while they saw heads being cut off, which gave them a violent and hateful image. A Tale of Two Cities, 1859, by Charles Dickens, was the first book to talk about tricoteuses. This helped to advance this picture. Dickens created tricoteuses like Madame Defarge, who would weave the names of people who had been killed into their work. There were also tricoteuses in Baroness Orcs's 1905 novel. The Scarlet Pimpernel also featured tricoteuses who sat there and knitted whilst head after head fell beneath the knife, and they themselves got quite bespattered with the blood of those cursed aristos. Public carts carried victims to the guillotine, creating an event-like atmosphere. During the French Revolution, the guillotine could kill 12 people every 13 minutes, which made the death toll go up very quickly. As time went on, the guillotine became more effective, mostly because Charles-Henri Sanson tried it himself on animals and dead bodies. Sanson put the guillotine to the test on Nicolas-Jacques Pelletier, who was a popular figure. The accuracy with which Pelletier's head was cut off from his body seemed to please Sanson, and the guillotine became more popular. Spectators began gathering to watch soldiers, called gendarmes, lead carts that carried condemned individuals. One eyewitness described the carts. "The same carts as those that are used in Paris for carrying wood. 4 boards were placed across them for seats, and on each board sat 2 and sometimes 3 victims. Their hands were tied behind their backs, and the constant jolting of the cart made them nod their heads up and down to the great amusement of the spectators." The solemn sadness before the beheading was often palpable. No matter how the condemned acted on the way to the guillotine, the officials who were walking toward the machine and the line of people who were about to be killed were usually in a sad mood. In 1793, J.G. Millingen wrote about an execution in which culprits who were led out in turn, and if necessary, supported by 2 of the executioner's valets. As an added bonus, Millingen remembered seeing some young men actually dance a few steps before they went up to be strapped to the perpendicular plane. In 1813, Colonel Francis Maccheroni recounted an execution that took place in Rome. The deep, solemn chanting of the Miserere was now heard, as from a distance the procession approached the silent square. Not a word was uttered, save a low murmuring sound when the 2 sufferers were seen advancing, each supported by a priest on either side, who recited prayers that were repeated by the dying man. A condemned person's final words were important. Some guillotine victims had their last words written down so that history would have something to look back on. King Louis XVI spoke to the crowd before he was put to death in 1793. He said, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid against me. I pardon those who caused my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be seen in France." The doomed were supposed to be strong even when they knew they were going to die, but not all of them did. Madame du Barry, who was married to Louis XV, begged the crowd, and maybe even the person who was going to kill her to give her one more moment. Some say that Marie Antoinette's last words were an apology to the man who was killing her for stepping on his foot. Executioners could emotionally distance themselves from the act of killing. Due to the fact that the guillotine provided a figuratively hands-off approach to the execution of capital punishment, executioners did not feel particularly bad about taking a life using this method. Executors were more concerned with the machine itself than with causing bloodshed or striking a blow. In addition, they were responsible for making preparations and cleaning up once the event finished. The guillotine's speed of execution eliminated some of the religious and social links that were previously associated with death and execution, which resulted in a reduction in the emotional impact of the spectacle. At first, the general public was critical of it, stating that it was too simple and clinical. It has been reported that people cried, "Give me back my wooden gallows," during the new technique for carrying out the execution. Botched beheadings did occur. The people who were going to kill King Louis XVIII did so in front of a big crowd in 1793. In 1792, the sans-culottes, or working-class commoners, arrested the ruler. The next year, he was put on trial for crimes against the people. Priest Henry Essex Edgeworth said that after he was found guilty and put to death, the king was taken under the axe of the guillotine, which with one stroke severed his head from his body. Different sources say that Louis XVI's neck was thick and may have needed more than one drop of the guillotine blade. Following Louis-Sébastien Mercier's account, the first blow did damage to the king's jaw and part of his head, but did not remove it. Some even say that guillotine killings went horribly wrong all the time, even though the person who made the machine meant to keep a handheld axe from moving. In Pamiers, France, there was one known case of a guillotine blade that did not fall all the way down and only hit the man in prison in the neck. The man's head still wasn't off after 5 tries. The man got up and tried to get away while the people who were killing him tried to figure out what was wrong. He started releasing blood into the crowd after being grabbed, and then he was cut off at the head. There was no mercy at the guillotine. During the height of his power, Maximilien Robespierre, who was the genius behind the reign of terror in France during the Revolution, was a staunch advocate of the guillotine and had ordered the murder of more than 17,000 people. Robespierre was also the mastermind behind several other atrocities. During the year 1794, revolutionaries took him into custody and sentenced him to death. Robespierre, who was incarcerated at the time, eventually became a victim of his own paranoia and oppression, following which he attempted to take his own life. Although he attempted to shoot himself in the head, the bullet only managed to break his jaw. There are, however, some suggestions that his guard may have been the one who shot him. During the process of attempting to put Robespierre's head onto the guillotine on July 28, 1794, it is said that one of the guards tore off Robespierre's bandages, therefore exposing his injuries. Executioners like to show off the heads. Even though the guillotine was supposed to be more compassionate and less brutal than other means of execution, audiences continued to attend executions and expected to see gore. Executioners were glad to carry out their duties, and they frequently displayed the head of the recently beheaded individual for the general public to witness. The executioner reportedly made Charlotte Corday's dismembered face flush by holding her head up and slapping her cheeks as she was being executed by guillotine in the year 1793. An observer wrote about this episode, stating that the eyes seemed to retain speculation for a moment or two, and there was a look in the ghastly stare with which they stared upon the crowd, which implied that the head was aware of the ignominious situation. This was a comment made by a spectator. The quantity of blood on guillotines generated nauseating scents, which prompted the people who lived in close proximity to the area to express their displeasure. There were times when the blood of a victim became highly prized, such as when masses rushed to dip their handkerchiefs in the sanguine mess that King Louis XVI had left behind before his death. Even though the guillotine altered the appearance of death, it did not completely eradicate the spectacle of death. The guillotine was terrifying in appearance. In the year 1813, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Macaroni, who was serving in Rome under the command of Joachim Murat, who was Napoleon's brother-in-law, was present during the execution of a businessman by the name of Venturi. During his explanation of the guillotine, he mentioned that its foundation consisted of hollow cube planks that were transported on wheels to create a platform. There were parallel wood beams with grooves on the edges, and as if it were a pile driving machine, there was a knife running between them. The blade was diagonal and about a foot square, and the upper side or back is loaded with some 20 pounds of metal. Macaroni went on to explain how the executioner positioned the condemned on the machine. The patient's head is not placed upon that block, but fixed just above it, between two pieces of wood, which embrace the neck, exactly as the two parts of the common village stocks confine the feet of the petty delinquent. The knife is drawn up to the top of the shafts by a rope, where it is retained by a kind of latch staple and a spring. Another cord on the other side, being pulled by the executioner, sets free the knife, which, passing with its diagonal edge close to the surface of the stocks that embrace the neck of the culprit, shaves off the head and would do so without the slightest check, were half a dozen human necks placed one over the other. Furthermore, Macaroni mentioned that guards would strap some individuals to the machine or a plank to keep them in place. People had visceral reactions to the guillotine. When people witnessed a beheading, they frequently experienced a variety of physical reactions, including passing out or making them throw up. A death by guillotine was something that Albert Camus' father witnessed, and it was something that led the man to throw up and never speak of the event again. Albert Camus wrote about his father's experience. According to Camus' reflections on the guillotine, written in 1957, his father watched as a convicted murderer in Algiers died via guillotine during World War I. My father wanted to attend an execution. He got up while it was still dark, for the place where the guillotine was set up was at the other end of the city, and once there found himself among a great crowd of spectators. He never told what he saw that morning. My mother could only report that he rushed wildly into the house, refused to speak, threw himself on the bed, and suddenly began to vomit. Camus went on to condemn the death penalty in general. Miniature guillotines made their way into people's homes. In addition to groups of women, children comprised a significant portion of the crowd during executions, which were considered to be significant occurrences. In the time that passed between beheadings, mothers brought their children, who may have entertained themselves at home by playing with miniature models of guillotines. Children were probably taught how to behead dolls, or even mice, in the guise of having fun through this activity. Not only were women able to wear earrings in the shape of guillotines, but they also had the ability to use little guillotines to chop vegetables and fruit and place them on their dinner tables. The humane killing device haunted Tolstoy for life. In a letter that he sent to Vasily Botkin, another writer, Leo Tolstoy detailed the emotions that he experienced after being there during the execution of Francis Richoux in Paris in the year 1857. Tolstoy, who had served in the military, stated that he had witnessed nothing more heinous than this ingenious and elegant machine by means of which they killed a strong, hale, and healthy man in an instant. He was of the opinion that the guillotine was corrupting because it created a repulsive crowd, with the parent describing to his daughter what a practical and wonderful mechanism it was, and so on. In his diary, Tolstoy lamented further, claiming the machine had shocked him to the extent that it kept him from sleeping. In his Confessions, 1879-1880, and again in What Is to Be Done, 1886, he described his guilt for having witnessed Richoux's death. At the moment, the head and body separated and fell into the box. I gasped and realized, not with my mind, nor with my heart, but with my whole being, that all the arguments in defense of capital punishment are wicked nonsense, and that however many people may combine to commit murder, the worst of all crimes, and whatever they may call themselves, murder remains murder, and that this crime had been committed before my eyes, and I, by my presence and non-intervention, had approved and shared in it. The execution profession ran in families. The presence of a member of the Sanson family was likely to be there in the event that folks were present during an execution in Paris during the Revolutionary period. The Sanson family was responsible for the execution of 19 individuals, including Charles Sanson, who was appointed as the executioner of Paris in the year 1688. His great-grandson, Charles-Henri Sanson, who was responsible for the execution of Louis XVI, and a multitude of other individuals during the latter part of the 18th century, and Henri Sanson, who was Charles-Henri's son and was responsible for the beheading of Marie Antoinette. Charles-Henri was a significant contributor to the implementation of the guillotine in France. Yet, there are many who assert that he had difficulty beheading Louis XVI. It was said that he did not take pleasure in his work, but according to all accounts, he considered himself to be providing France with a service that was essential. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.